Dear guests, speakers and moderators, welcome to the panel discussions, Transforming Power Dynamics in MHPSS Localization. I am Blair Taspahiu, head of the child protection sector in Terre des Hommes. Before starting the meeting, I'm just going to give a very short overview of the day today so that we know a bit how the day is organized, even though you have received the agenda. So this event will end at about 12:50 today. After that, as you know, we will have a time and a space for networking and a little buffet that will be served. So we hope you will stay until the end of the event to really take advantage of that space. We will also have a 15 minutes break at around 11 o'clock. And of course, during the panel discussion, there is space for questions and answers that our moderators will definitely explain how it will be managed. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Barbara Hintermann, the General Director of Terre des Hommes, for the opening remarks of this event. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody, also our dear participants online. I would like to welcome you to this important event here at the Club de la Presse, how we call it here in Geneva. Just first, a small word on our organization, Terre des Hommes Foundation. We are the largest Swiss child rights organization, currently operating in about 30 countries around the globe, in Asia, in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, in Africa. We work in conflict countries like, for example, the Sahel region, Ukraine, Gaza and the West Bank, but also Lebanon, and Myanmar, Afghanistan, not to forget. And we also work in more fragile and more stable contexts, ranging from Albania to Greece, to Kenya, to India and Nepal, for example. I guess that we all agree the scars of wars and other forms of violence against children and young people are not only physical. Children trapped in the wars will likely face trauma, individual, collective trauma, up to generational trauma, depending on the scale of the wars. As a 10-year-old girl from Gaza told us, I wanted to become an engineer, but since the start of this war, I have realized that I'll never be anything. I will never be anything. These are very disturbing words heard from a child. These words show us that when talking of mental health issues or trauma, it is not only about health. This goes far beyond. She has lost hope of having a profession, a solid position in her society, and reduces herself to almost nothing. Mental health encompasses our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It influences how we think, how we feel, how we act, and make choices. Just like physical health, it is crucial for fulfilling life. Unfortunately, mental health have been on the rise. According to WHO, 1 in 4 people, including children and young persons, will experience mental health challenges in their lifetime. That is a staggering figure, and it emphasizes how important it is for us to address this issue. Today we gather in Geneva, a city known as the epicenter of global power and knowledge production in the field of humanitarian and development aid. Yet, as we sit here in this privileged space, we must acknowledge a sobering reality: the erosion of international law and the increasing disregard for children's rights and their protection globally. This erosion is not just an abstract concept. It has immediate and devastating consequences for civilians, particularly for children and young people. As international frameworks fail to uphold the rights of children in conflict zones and fragile states, but not only, we see alarming outcomes. The mental health of our youth is deteriorating. They are subjected to violence, instability, and neglect, which deeply impacts their emotional well-being. The need for mental health and psychosocial support is growing, and we must respond not only with urgency, but with resilience and conscientious action. At Terre, mental health and psychosocial support is one of our expertise. For years, we have refined our concept and processes to ensure that our interventions are relevant and contextualized. And we have worked with local partners for a long time already. Yet, we recognize that to be truly sustainable, these efforts must grow and involve local actors much more and in a more effective manner. Community-based mental health and psychosocial support emphasizes the importance of local participation and local leadership, ensuring that local networks and existing support structures become central to decision-making, enabling us to design interventions that are inclusive and responsive to the specific needs and strengths of affected communities. We have recently adopted at Terre des Hommes our new partnership and localization policy, which is, by the way, publicly available, which reflects a strong commitment from us to empower local partners, communities, and in particular, children and youth. It is vital that their voices are heard, taken into consideration, and that they play a crucial role in shaping the future of mental health and psychosocial support strategies. We must build frameworks of well-being that are adapted to various needs. A trauma of a child living in a war zone is not only a health issue. It needs to be addressed in a holistic manner, considering health, of course, but also his or her smooth and effective continuation of education and social well-being within the family structure and the community. Effective service delivery and building a better understanding of the dynamics at play within a community can, however, only be ensured by strengthening the local system and by embracing participatory action, research, and bringing back the power to these communities. Today, we launch the Initiative for Localization and Transformational Power Sharing of Mental Health and Psychosocial Support, aiming to shape and lead the debate on localization and to start deconstructing the power structures that often leave marginalized voices unheard. It is essential that we open channels for dialogue, challenging the status quo, and critically reflect on our current practices. As we work toward true localization of mental health and psychosocial support, we must engage key actors within their organizations to identify necessary changes, recognizing the distinct challenges they face in their context. By supporting their leadership in shaping mental health and psychosocial support approaches, we can create meaningful change. So together, let us reaffirm our commitment today, especially for the children and young people who are suffering. Let us bridge the gap between decision makers and the communities they affect. Our actions must embody the principles of respect, inclusion, and empowerment so that every child and young person can thrive, free from the burdens imposed by conflict and despair. So I hope you have an interesting and inspiring morning, and I wish you really that we can make progress all together. I'm looking forward to listen to all the experts online, but certainly the panel here. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much, Barbara, for your insightful opening remarks. I think it already sets well the stage for the discussion of today. Before we dive in the discussion, we're just going to take a few minutes to present ourselves, Lourdes and I, the moderators of the panel of today, and also explain a little bit how we have divided the discussion today. So I'm Maria Bray. I'm the global MHPSS advisor for Terre des Hommes. And I actually have a background in cross-cultural psychology and anthropology. And I must say that this thematic we're having all today, this topic, is something that is very, has been in my journey from the really beginning. A bit, I would say, probably like 20 years ago, when it was my first assignment, I was sent to Afghanistan. And as a psychologist, I was requested to open a consultation, a one-to-one consultation for children in a children's center. And really typically, I was supposed to open this office at the end of the corridor, in the little room that was left, available. And from this really first day, I realized how, off this kind of request was, linked with the context and with the environment in which we were living in. So at that stage already, I tried to challenge a little bit this task, and I find myself actually to support the animators working in the centers rather than myself, putting in place a psychological consultation. So, and I think that I've been trying all my last 20 years to try to support and strengthen local approaches and intervention. But I was also involved, I would say, in developing approaches that can be fitting different contexts, right? And I do believe that actually both approaches are valid and can work in the environment where we are. Though we need to really acknowledge that there is a proper place for each of this approach to take place in our work. And I'm very happy today to be co-moderating this panel with Lourdes. So she's working with us. We've been working together for a while now. And we've been discussing about this topic a lot when we developed recently the MHPSS framework, where we tried to really make sure that it could be adaptable to different contexts and flexible to be used. Over to you.
Thank you, Maria. Indeed, it's a long journey. My name is Lourdes Carrasco, and I am also a psychologist, a Spanish psychologist. Also, as Maria is saying, what the journey that brings me here, it's a bit of a personal. Also, 20 years back, when I completed my psychology studies, and I realized how disappointing was the disconnection that we had in the university, in the academia, that we were learning separated concepts from context, from inequalities, from injustice, and it was kind of abstract mental health. So this disappointment led me to specialize myself further in human rights, political violence, and these intersections with mental health. Funny enough that in the latest years I've been teaching at the university and the curriculum has not changed. So I'm doing double efforts to try to see how these 15 years in the middle that I've been working in the field, in the MHPSS, in humanitarian aid, I've learned so much from very different people, and how psychology can promote growth and liberation, but it can also perpetuate systems of oppression. And what is the difference is how we do it, how do we position ourselves. And I think it's vital to recognize the power that lies in psychological science academia and also in the international aid sector. And that is actually my commitment that brings me here, the personal commitment, which is to constantly question our roles, my roles, perspectives, but also to listen, to learn, and to deconstruct. And I humbly believe that we can establish these dialogues between diverse people and to create a new way of thinking, of being and doing. And that is the reason, actually, that we are here today.
Thank you, Lourdes. So just a few words again on the topic of today, right? We're speaking about localization of mental health and psychosocial support. What do we mean by mental health and psychosocial support? I think we have many people online, and also maybe some of you are not used with this, acronym, I would say, MHPSS. And just to clarify that here, again, we really refer to any type of support that will promote well-being and prevent and response to any mental condition, right? So this is really, we have to keep in mind that we are speaking about the wide continuum of care, from community support up to clinical support in specialized health services, for example. As to localization, I think that we, of course, refer here to the need of shifting and supporting the power of communities to lead the response in MHPSS, but also to make sure that we prioritize local needs and responses. And so I think these are important to keep in mind when we speak about localization. Obviously, we need, and this is the idea of today's discussion, is that we can't be speaking about localization of MHPSS without actually including the need of looking at power more closely and the need to shifting power.
And even if there has been an evolution actually in the child protection and MHPSS sector, there is often insufficient attention that we bring to exactly why these changes has happened. We do talk a lot about less top-down approaches, more bottom-up approaches to create less dependency, to be more sustainable, but we rarely discuss how there are deeply rooted power imbalances that are actually shaped by colonial history. And this colonial history does influence everything, from the resource distribution to whose voices are heard. Actually, this is something that, as I said, is a personal commitment as white European psychologists. That is the way that we need also, and I believe that we need to start deconstructing. And that is why we are here to critically examine these power imbalances that we usually don't talk that much. And it is also intentional, and as Barbara said, we are in a privileged setting here in Geneva, and it's also intentional to bring the discussions here, because we would like to start deconstructing power exactly at the heart of where power lies, which is here.
Thank you, Lourdes. So just maybe a word on TDH's journey into that, space. And I mean, we started internally some years back to look into power, right? To try to look at closely how we were dealing with power internally as well as externally, trying to better understand this concept. And so we've been working on this journey for now 2 or 3 years, especially in the framework of supporting child and youth empowerment in our work. And so this new initiative now that brings us together today for the launch is really trying to even do a more close-up around MHPSS linked with this power shifting.
We did all these consultations internally.
Yeah, so we started, thanks Lourdes. So we started this, for this initiative, of course, the first big step for us is opening the dialogue. And we have actually started opening this dialogue in that last summer, when we started, looking institutionally into this initiative and giving the floor to the people we work with in the context where we work. So there's been a massive consultation with more than 19 countries where we work, trying to listen to what our colleagues on the field have to say around MHPSS localization, the challenges, the opportunities. And for us, that was important to really start by the field and to listen to the field voices. We had, of course, invaluable insights that really will shape and help us shape the way the dynamics is going to be developed. And another important, actually, piece, I would say, contribution to developing this initiative is also today's discussion, right? Where we are also opening the floor today to people that are not within TDH direct perimeter, and that can really bring us a lot of inputs, right? Both from the academic world and from the practitioner side, into what have been working, not working, where exactly are the challenges, and where should we start, right, if we want to deconstruct that.
So that's just the main objectives, actually, is to look at what is happening now in the existing models and what might be recommendations to shape this localization and actually in how to transform or power sharing. And I think we can
I think now we can move on to present our esteemed panelists we have with us today. So let me introduce all of them one by one, and they would come on stage. So we've got first Dr. Neziswa Titi, an academic activist from the University of Cape Town, whose work focuses on decolonial, feminist, and child-centered approach to African mental health. Welcome, Neziswa. So next we have Kristen, a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Bath that brings over 15 years of experience in child participation, child protection, researching feminist and decolonial approaches to child participation. We are also joined by Ananda, Galappatti, who is a medical anthropologist. He spent nearly 30 years advancing mental health and psychosocial support in Sri Lanka globally, particularly in crisis setting, and is the strategic director today of MHPSS.net, a platform that is well known by the specialists. Then we've got Dr. Nancy Bowen with us. She's the founder of the Psychosocial Services and Training Institute in Cairo, Egypt, and she has an extensive experience in MHPSS in conflict zones. And then we are joined online by Patrick Mangen. I think he's going to be there. I think we can see him online. So he was meant to be with us. And so Patrick is an MHPSS practitioner who has dedicated 25 years to designing large-scale community mental health programs across East and Southern Africa. He's today the Chief Executive Officer of REPSSI, the Regional Psychosocial Support Initiative, which is a Pan-African organization in East and Southern Africa. Welcome, Patrick. And then last but not least, we've got Shadi from Terre des Hommes. With over 20 years of experience, he has been instrumental in child protection and MHPSS programs in Palestine and Jordan. So just a very quick work on how the conference is going to be organized. We're going to have 3 sessions.
Yes, if we can look at the agenda, maybe. If we can, I don't know if it's projected or not, or if you have it. But just for everyone to have an idea on how do we structure the next hours. We are going to have 3 sessions. So we start by first session where we aim at naming the issues. What are the issues? What are these local versus universal concepts, power imbalances, what challenges? So it's setting the scene. And then in the second session, we aim at exploring these issues a bit from the practice. So our speakers with a round of shared experiences, they will try to share successful experiences in success and challenges, and how do we face them in the direct practice. And after each session, as you can see, we will have space for questions and answers. Limited time, but we will make every effort to incorporate inputs from everyone, and of course from online audience and people here in the room. And last, we will end up by the third session on recommendations, where our speakers will share and propose actionable strategy solutions that we can propose. and we will have some closing remarks and then this space for networking too.
Just a little word to make sure that we were requested with by our online participants who just try to speak slowly. So I think this is for all of us.
I think it's,
in mind.
I'm very sorry.
So let's move on.
Yes, so let's start, and thank you very much. Let's start by this first session. Let's start to name the issues, to set the theoretical scene. And we will start by our colleagues, mostly from the academia, but not only. And I give the word to Dr. Neziswa Titi. Thank you very much. And you can introduce as you prefer.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I am Neziswa Titi. I am coming from South Africa. South Africa is in Africa in the global south. So that is the positionality that I will be speaking from. Time is of the essence, as I saw that big hourglass outside. So I probably have 9 minutes and 30 seconds. That is who I am. I'm going to talk about context. Context is of the essence. Even in Africa, the countries in Africa, the regions in Africa, the communities in Africa, they must be understood in context. And the children who live there must also be understood in context. What I'm going to address today is that context specificity is important. I'm going to address the big animal in the room around psychological science imagining itself to be a one-size-fits-all. A one-size-fits-all that is imagined from where exactly? Do you know? Usually the global north. So epistemic justice is important. How people come to know what they know, whether the spaces, the mainstream ways of being and thinking create the platforms for indigenous group people and thinkers to self-determine. And thus, based on that, we have to decolonize the practices that we use. Minus ourselves from the colonial imaginings of what life is, what mental health is, what crisis is. So, understanding children in the global south is very important at first, to understand the cultural fluidity that indigenous children exist in as an outcome of colonization, as an outcome in South Africa of apartheid, where children and their families have been displaced from their environments and thus live in in-between worlds. By what I mean by that is that one child will live in an urban area. However, they go on holiday in a rural area, and they go to school in a suburb, where they come to all of you for mental health work and support. And you, all of us here, use models that alienate that very same child, causing confusion to the psyche of that child by imagining a child to be like the exact same child that you saw yesterday. And then reinforcing this idea that this child must fit into this predetermined model that was not conceptualized from the environment and the context that that child lives in. So what that says is that culture must be central. The relevance of culture must be a fundamental point from which we work with children. The theories, i.e. attachment theory, we have to look to understand it based on where the child is situated, whether those norms are norms for where that child is from.
or whether those are the norms from the models and textbooks that were created for us. So I write about all of that in that publication on the screen, I mean. My work is around the experiences of children, the experience of children who have faced all forms of victimizations. So in addressing the traumas that children face, the theoretical level is important, the models we use. The package level is important, how we work and how we operate and address children. And then the intervention that we employ. So in my work, I find centering on the child to be very important. Centering on the child experience, the child's ontology, the way they are, the child epistemology, how the child comes to know what they know, how the child comes to know what they have experienced, the traumas, the sexual victimizations that they have experienced. What is it from the child's point of view? Understanding that experience the intersectional identities of the child that then inform how they make sense of this. The child's gender, the child's class, the nationality, whether they are migrants or not, the age, the religion, the cultural practice, everything around that child, what the child does at home, what is being practiced. Because all of those inform who the child is and how they make sense of what is happening to them and with them. And gender is very much part of this. LGBTQI children must also be understood in context as well, because that is also how they then make sense of what is happening to them and around them. And then, as I said, speaking from an African-centered perspective is important in my work. Africa, the place, the geography, the spaces in Africa, and the people. So in understanding, in applying and centering on the child's experience intersectionally, their identities and their exposures is a good place to depart from. Therefore, then, with children, we like to play, right? But what forms of play are we exposing children to? Is it play that we are accustomed to as upper class, middle class people? Even in Africa, there are class issues, right? So the plays that we then introduce to children, is it play that is reminding children of what's around them that they don't have, but which we have? How do we play with children? Who sets the tone? Spirituality. Of course, we are the diverse people, but many people, including the families and the children that we work with, use spirituality as a form of sense-making. You don't have to believe in it, but acknowledge it. Families, the construction of families, everybody, there is an understanding that Black children, African children, come from broken families. But whose standard is that? The nuclear family? Whose standard is that? Certainly not where I come from. We believe in extended families. Then you come with attachment theory that reinforces this idea that if a child has multiple mothers, that there's something wrong with that child. No. There's something wrong with the model and the position, the model being used, and the positionality of the mental health practitioner in front of that child that wants that child to assimilate their worldviews, and that is wrong. Psycholinguistics, speech thinking. Do we understand how children speak? Do we understand how they formulate their reasoning? of psychological issues in their minds and then give them back to us? Do we understand how language is formulated from the child's environment? Do we know that? So these are the things that we as practitioners must acquaint ourselves with first before engaging with children. So, and these are just some ideas that I found when I first understood how children made meaning of the aromas that they experienced. So the interventions that I came up with, which I coined, are exclusively based on what children said about what they experienced, what they reported back around the meanings that they made. So within the colonial approach, we address power by virtue of understanding who holds the narrative in the room. Is it the child or the expert? The child or the adult? The hierarchies, right? And then being Afrocentric in Africa, being Brazil-centric, being Chinese-centric, being Sri Lanka-centric, understands the context, the cultures, the language, the histories. Child-centricity with children does not mean that we disregard other voices. It means that we center, we lift the voices of children. So the context, deconstructing the practice of psychology. Where is it coming from? What models? Who conceived them? Indigenous aroma theory, looking at the whole child, psychologically, emotionally, religiously, their soul, their spirit, their mind, everything. And feminism, issues around voice, positioning, reality from the perspective of the child. And understanding that patriarchy also affects men or male bodies, right? It also affects male bodies. And then how then, when children come to us having been victimized, what we do. Because men are part of children's lives. What are the messages then that we send out? So we need to bear then in mind that with mental health, psychosocial support, if you want children to value what we do, that the adherence to the practice, them coming back to us and following following the course, the process that we have outlined, that it depends on the child beliefs and requires from us understanding children's values, shared histories, experiences, and languages that form part of the culture and of the child and influence how then children perceive and experience their life experiences. Because language is a driver of culture. So if we don't understand the languages of children, then what are we then doing? So therefore, effective psychological interventions, mental health interventions with children should begin from the point that culture is highly relevant in children's behaviors, sense-making and decision-making, to work with us or not, to trust us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neziswa, for all these, also the from where, by whom perspectives and epistemic justice. And with no further delay, I'll give the floor to Kristen. And please, as I don't know if you want to, yeah, so go ahead.
Hello, good morning. Neziswa, you're a very hard act to follow, particularly since I am actually the only non-psychologist on the panel today. So thank you very much for having me. I'm really honored to be here. And yes, so my name is Kristen Hope. I worked for many years with TDH But currently I'm undertaking PhD research at the University of Bath, linked to the Center for Decolonizing Knowledge, Teaching and Practice at the University of Bath. And my research adopts a feminist decolonial approach to explore questions around child protection and child participation with international NGOs. And so what I'm here today as a non-psychologist to try to paint a broader picture of the, why these questions are important, and kind of paint a picture of the broader context in which today's discussion takes place. So first of all, I'd like to start by speaking about my positionality. So I myself was born in a settler colonial context in the Caribbean. And I've come to think about this in relation to the work that I've done for 15 years working for international NGOs across the world. And I've come to think about the ways in which colonial relationships of power sustain racialized patterns of labor in international development, and also how this functions to sometimes legitimize external expertise from Europe or from the global north, and link this to concepts in decolonial theory that speak about saviorism. So one of the early post-colonial scholars, Gayatri Spivak, who's Indian, spoke at length in her work about how the narratives of saviorism were a central justification to the so-called civilizing missions of European colonial projects. So Spivak describes how in 19th century India, British colonialists created moral arguments against the practice of sati, widow burning, to legitimize expansion of British imperial governance in India. And Spivak speaks about her phrase, her catchphrase is, we describe that as what was white men saving brown women from brown men. So to paraphrase Spivak, when I reflect on my own experiences, I've often asked myself, to what extent have I been a white woman saving brown children or brown young people from brown adults who might be causing them harm? To what extent is my own history tainted in white saviorism? Now, speaking about this positionality here, it's not a form of self-flagellation, and it's not a form of narcissism. It's an attempt to express, in the words of post-colonial feminists Jackie Alexander and Chandra Mohanty, responsibility, accountability, and solidarity as part of a paradigm of decolonization which stresses power, history, memory, relational analysis, justice, and ethics. It is an attempt to consider how the critical lens offered by decolonial theory can allow for certain conversations in our sector that are, quite frankly, still difficult to have. And I think that the ability for us to have these conversations today and the openness for TDH to support this space for a critical discussion reflects this new wave of the way in which post-colonial decolonial theory is gaining ground in child-focused development and humanitarianism. Since the publication and the ratification of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, universalizing narratives of child rights have been a dominant paradigm in international child-focused agencies. Now, we can and we should credit children's rights with many positive changes in the lives of children all around the world. There are long lists. I'm not going to list everything, but perhaps most significantly, the CRC positioned children as subjects with agency, not just as passive objects or as possessions of adults in their lives. However, it's critical that this credit does not overshadow the challenges that universal child rights discourse presents. Scholarly critiques of children's rights in general and international child protection in particular have highlighted the ways in which discourses of universalism can mask Eurocentrism. In 2012, the Basque scholar Matthias Arce argued that the authors of the CRC adopted the image of a middle-class European child when they were drafting the convention. This child was seen as, quote, vulnerable, dependent, needy and unknowing, and sheltered inside the family home, inside the school, inside the daycare institution, inside the play center. And this explains why many critical childhood scholars have looked at the ways in which the convention and other rights-based international instruments are unable to adequately account for and make sense of the lives of other children, including street children, working children, children on the move, or children in contexts of conflict. Drawing on this logic, scholar Sam Okiere has argued that childhoods and communities which do not conform to the hegemonic norms of international child protection can be discredited as inappropriate or anti-developmental. And to what extent do these tropes justify interventions by organizations? So, these critical scholars are asking us very important questions. They're asking researchers and practitioners in the field of international development to acknowledge at first, and then think about to what extent do we dismantle these historic systems of oppression and exploitation and structural violence. Scholars writing earlier this year, Blomer and Varga, have said, there is a need to perpetually ask questions about how children and notions of childhood are always implicated in colonialism and its vestiges. At the same time, it's important that we don't get stuck in binaries, right? Because unlike my outfit today, the world is not black and white. For adults working in this space, it would be crude to assume that all of those who work in child-focused humanitarian and development fields are from the global north, or that even if they are from the global north, that they share some common sense of history. Just even amongst the child protection professionals in this room today, we all come from different places. Some of us grew up under totalitarian regimes in the former USSR. Some of us grew up under apartheid states. Some of us grew up under occupation. It is clear that as much as the image of the universal child is a false one, so is the image of the universal child protection practitioner. It's also a limited trope. So when we also think about breaking down these binaries, we should think about breaking down these binaries for ourselves and also for the children we serve. Scholar Afua Tuamdanso Imo said earlier this year that while binaries can be useful in explaining and discussing children's lives from a global perspective, that these binaries are limited because they gloss over the layers of nuance within which the plurality of childhoods in each area exists, which are influenced by class, influenced by migration status, influenced by ethnicity, influenced by gender. So in line with this nuanced approach, I would argue that we should be allowed to open ourselves up to uncomfortable questioning. And that this has to be done with a critical eye to the broader social, political, and economic fragmentation that exists in our world today. Whether we're looking at the rise of anti-immigrant populism across Europe, which many economists and political theorists have argued, is a consequence of the long tail of the 2008 financial crisis. Whether we're looking at the increase in authoritarianism, which restricts civic spaces, or whether we're looking at the flagrant violations of international law that are, in some cases, supported by Western democracies, as we look at the devastation of lives in Palestine and what the ICJ has described as plausible grounds for genocide in their advisory opinions earlier this year. And we ask, how does living in these moments shake the foundations of the international principles around which we base our work? So we have to critically acknowledge also that children are aware of this fragmentation. Echoing what Neziswa was saying, when we ask children to, when we center their views and perspectives, we should also understand that the children who are living in the world today are also aware of the fragility of these promises of the international system that we have made in the name of children's rights. They can see how their world is shaped by COVID, by climate crisis, and by conflict, which is live streamed on their devices. This is all, of course, impacts their mental health, but it should also locate them as experts in their lives that we need to understand as we confront their realities. So, moving to conclusion, as we find ourselves in this context of compounding crisis, I think that decolonial theory is an important lens for analysis when we're thinking about our topic today, about transforming power relationships in MHPSS, because it asks us to acknowledge that we from the global north, stop thinking about what it means to teach others, what it means to cope or to be resilient, and how we should think about how our approaches are informed by the expertise of lived experience of all of us that comes through living in an era of shared vulnerability, because we're all vulnerable. these discussions today are an opportunity for us to think outside of the boxes that we so often use in our thinking as NGOs, whether in terms of logical frameworks or technical silos. It's an invitation to make space for critical thinking and reflection amongst child-focused professionals. And it's also an opportunity for a more sophisticated reading of how structural factors, such as race and class, shape social norms and established practices in our sector, in order to start to dismantle them as part of an ethics of mutual care and as part of moving from saviorism towards solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yes. Thank you very much, Kristen. And then I pass the floor to Ananda.
Great, thank you very much, and good morning to you all. I'll just introduce myself briefly in terms of, so on the way over here, Neziswa and I was trying to explain to her why my accent changes involuntarily, and a lot of it is to do with the fact that I'm really from nowhere in particular. I'm in between lots of places, you know, operating within Sri Lanka, which is where I'm from, within different communities and different contexts, on the capital versus a small town on the East Coast. There was conflict affected for many years between Sri Lanka and Geneva, between local organizations and the ISC reference group, between disciplines as well, between, you know, psychology. Well, I started actually off as a natural scientist and then in social sciences. And I think my role is very much has been as a mediator and broker and someone who sort of pulls together and tries to make sense of different perspectives. And that, I think, is where some of what my narrative today is coming from. So Neziswa and Kristen talked about the broader context of history and kind of hegemonic conceptual categories within which a lot of the work that we talk about is located, situated, and that's really important. What I'm going to do is something slightly different. I'm going to talk about some of these issues from within the field of MHPSS, which is a somewhat more limited frame. And so I'm going to start off with the question of, you know, we talk about localization, but have we been here before? Is this new? And if it is not new, and if we have been here, is there anything that we can learn from the past of how we tried to deal with this or failed to deal with this? Right? So I think a good place to start is the fact that MHPSS, the very term and the field as we know it now, post-2007, was built on a foundational rift within the field of responding to suffering in conflict zones. Right? Many of you who are familiar, but I'll recap it for those who were maybe not present at the time, was that in the 1990s, late 1990s and the early 2000s, there was a real fault line that opened up in the field between those who very crudely characterized as the trauma versus resilience divide. There were those, Inga Agger talks about it, where there was those who focused on resilience, or used that language, focused on the capacities, the frameworks, the rights and the agency of those who were affected to solve their problems and take care of themselves and recover. And sometimes the inequalities and the violence as being causes of and central to suffering. Whereas those characterized as being from the more trauma discourse, you know, framework, coming from an application of clinical Western work with refugees in the 1980s, often perhaps frame this much more narrowly in terms of medical concepts and treatments that focused on the minds or through the minds of affected people, right? And this really caused this schism. People were not talking to each other. There was a real difference, even though there was obviously a lot of truth on both sides about the nature of suffering and certainly things that people did to help. And Derek Summerfield was like the poster boy man of the the critiques, the people who are providing critiques like Celia Petty and Patrick Bracken and so on. And I recommend that seminal article as something that would be quite interesting to just to recap some of those perspectives. But what was quite interesting was that Alistair Ager, the influential thinker at the time, who tried to make sense of what the tensions in the psychosocial discourse were, and that's 1997, quite a long time ago, and he identified three tensions. One is general, on one hand, are interventions generalizable, or are they unique to a context? On the other hand, are they derived from technical knowledge, i.e., Western scientific knowledge of certain varieties, or are they based on indigenous understandings? And lastly, are they targeted or community-based? The last one I'm going to skip a little bit, but I'll talk a little bit, and this echoes some of what Neziswa was talking about in terms of, on the one end of the spectrum, the idea that you have a one-size-fits-all, that it worked over there, so it'll work over here, right? On the other hand, saying, no, you can't take things across. Context is crucial. You have to be culturally sensitive. You have to work with what the community is already prioritized, and you have to build on what's there. You cannot impose or bring it. And so, this tension is something that, existed back then, and we're still talking about it today, right? The other one is around the question of whose knowledge counts, whose knowledge matters. Culturally specific versus universal frameworks. Which ones do we privilege? Which ones do we use in our understanding of what is suffering and what therefore might be the ways that we respond to that? And which forms of these understandings influence the way that we design program content, goals, structure, activities, monitoring, evaluation, etc. And how do we accommodate maybe the relative merits of and what these different multiple perspectives offer, right? And I would say that one thing that Alistair failed to list, which I think is very relevant in this, particularly at this time, is the question of what I call the missing tension, which is, do we address the causes of suffering, or do we address just the consequences, right? And these are issues that we confront in the context of intimate partner violence, child abuse, torture, in the context of displacement and loss of property, community, and identity, in the context of enforced disappearances and the quest for truth and justice, and of course, very pertinently, to the question of bombardment and ongoing war atrocities, right? And what are the implications for where we fit on that, for what we do, right? In terms of justice and rights, in terms of what actually works, what will have the biggest impact on people's lives, and what is going to result in sustainable outcomes, and what aligns with what people want and need in their views. So the IAC reference group, IAC guidelines of 2007 invented the field of MHPSS. The term was coined then. And it did the job of peace building. It unified a divided field and so on. And the question is, how successfully did it do that? Did it address some of these underlying challenges? And Catherine Rayberg in 2014 did this review of the critiques of early MHPSS that Vanessa Putpavac and Derek Summerfield had made. And try to look at the guidelines and the practices and say, have those criticisms been addressed? And her accounting was that in some ways, the notion of homogenization is addressed, at least in the text. It's saying that acknowledging the diversity of different approaches, the question of just having more pathologizing perspectives that use Euro-American kind of nosological categories was also addressed in the accommodation of both kind of quote-unquote Western and non-Western concepts and also activities. The thing that she noted, which I think is going, I'll speak about it in a little bit, is that one of the things that may not have been identified and was not actually very present in the critiques was the question of power, right? They didn't talk about power in those tensions. And essentially power that's identified with particular modalities and approaches to measurement, grant making and funding and so on. And these that are located in the global north. Right? So this is my last slide. I just want to kind of talk about where the field is right now. So, you know, at one level, things have never been bigger or better for MHPSS. There's more money, there's more visibility, and you can't talk about emergencies without MHPSS. Very different from the late 1980s when it was absent, right? And there's tons of programming going on. We have lots and lots of intervention models, tools, guidance, more than you can keep up with, and evidence, you know. But there is a tendency towards global standardization. You talk to people in lots of different places, the agencies are doing the same things, right? They might be working at different levels of the IAC pyramid, but there are lots of, you know, standardized packages, standardized interventions with adaptation, but that's what dominates the landscape in many ways. Not exclusively. I mean, there are also, of course, a continuing set of homegrown and more contextual approaches, but these are the ones that have the most visibility and prominence, and these are the ones that are being promoted. And I think what's very interesting to see is that even as we talk about localization, even as we talk about transformation, we talk about the need for community-based approaches, and from 2018 we've seen, you know, a greater emphasis even in global fora, Rebuilding Lives conference in Berlin, the Global Mental Health Summit in 2019 in the Netherlands, and since then, you know, various publications from the ISC and others talked about it. But there's something about the structures and bureaucracies of financing, project cycles, and implementation at an institutional level that actually preclude a lot of those possibilities. I mentioned this yesterday in another forum, but I recently spoke to a group of program managers who are implementing programs in a particular setting, and asked how many of them had been involved in the design of the proposals that they were implementing, and none had been. If they're not involved in that, how much chance is there that communities and affected people are going to be, right? And increasingly the barriers to some of this are about, you know, the timetables, the sequencing of financing, but they're also about norms within institutions where you say, these are the approved approaches, these are the common approaches, you get points for this, you will be a part of a recognized administrative system if you stick to the same approaches across the region, even if the contexts don't really call for them, right? So, okay, if that's the reality, how well equipped are we to talk about this? So I would say that MHPSS as a field is, sadly, the discourse is, this is an unusual space, highly normative and noticeably debate-free. We have a consensus because we don't talk about difficult things. And I'm not sure whether that's because we're either conflict-averse, because of the traumatic history of our schism in the, right? Or whether it's actually that this also serves to perpetuate the status quo. There is a reticence, or perhaps you could say a blindness, to the questions of power and the dynamics that permeate every level of the field. And I would say that we largely lack the language, concepts, and the safe spaces for us to be able to work through these contradictions and tensions, right? Last word. I just want to highlight the fact that we have colleagues, most recently in Gaza and in Lebanon, speaking about the priorities for addressing suffering, around addressing ongoing violence. And this is not something that is unfamiliar. This is the same that we hear and that I have experienced and I have also called for in contexts like in Sri Lanka, but also every conflict zone and many contexts of inequality and harm to communities. But somehow there is no space in which we can actually talk about that and talk about why it is that we can't. So we've had to have spaces, but they're often very private. There's small groups of individuals maybe that meet online or in person who talk about this, but not in our fora. And this is what we perhaps need to build to be able to address the bigger questions. Yeah, I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thanks a lot to our three first panelists that has been, I mean, interestingly, there's one word that caught my attention is about space, right? Giving the space for children, for reflection, for appropriate and, discussion with the right people at the right time. So I'm just going to give over now the floor to our three other panelists to actually react or comment or add on, right, what was just said by Neziswa, Kristen, and Ananda. So I first give the floor to Patrick. So I think Patrick is online. So Patrick, can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, I can hear you, Maria. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you and we can see you. All good.
Oh,
so over to you.
Thank you very much. Just to add to that impressive panel discussion, lots of key issues came up which we encounter in the field. The one I would want to emphasize is indigenous knowledge, and it's been mentioned by several of the panelists in the context of localization. Local communities, the way we see and interact with them, hold the wealth of indigenous knowledge. They can respond. They are more resilient than sometimes we imagine, and they can quickly pull together resources to strengthen the child protection or the systems that can deliver interventions to communities to alleviate suffering and deal with daily stressors. So that's extremely important. As example, as we go about trying to collect evidence on what is working, as many of you perhaps have, is the whole issue around RCTs and what do those do to disenfranchising local knowledge. I think it was Neziswa who mentioned that psychological intervention should not be seen as universal, which is true. And sometimes moving an intervention that has been tested in a different context and hoping that you're going to scale it and replicate it in the South or in a different context does not always work. So we have to be cautious with how we do that. To what extent do we directly engage communities, tapping into existing knowledge, and putting them at the forefront of knowledge open.
Patrick, can you hear us? We have lost you, I think.
Yes, I completed my submission.
Okay. You were finished?
Yes, I did, Maria. Okay. I finished this.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I think that, this point of indigenous knowledge, and just to clarify, because you used the RCT wording, this refers to randomized controlled trial, which is actually really the kind of typical methodology used by scientific research. And indeed, I think it's very important to actually question sometimes this approach in linked with context, while there might be other ways of researching evidence than using this kind of very standardized, universal approach to evidence generation. Thank you very much, Patrick. We'll hear now from Shadi. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I was enjoying listening to you. And my comments about what I will start with something just to speak about it, about the hierarchy in the room. Who will follow or who the story, the narrative will be more for the child or the therapist. So if we change it, we say in the room there is the one who have money and the other who don't have money. The one who have money, who speak English, and he have some theories and knowledge, and the other who's the community, who His English, it'll be quick, like my English. So how the hierarchy will be in this room? Who will decide? And I think this is one of the challenges that we have it in this field. This field based on donation, donors, and fundraising. And we can't ignore that with money, the power came and the power dynamic came, and there's someone who will decide. This is a case that we have it all the time. So we can't speak about localization without speaking about resource and financial resource and how we deal with that. How we can reach a point where, yes, as communities that we don't have our resource, we need this money, but still we need to think about how will this money can be really free or have the space to speak. So I will connect that about how we identify the needs and who identified the needs. Because we are listening since maybe 10, 20 years that local people should be involved in identifying the needs, and we saw a lot of models about that. But still, the local people, they are not happy, at least from where I came. We are not happy about how needs are identified and who are participating in that. So I'll give one example about once I called NGOs in the Middle East, and I told them, why you hire people in the mental health who are not specialized in mental health? They say, because they don't speak English, but these people are speaking English. So the most important thing, speaking English. Because they want some people to communicate with them, to bring the information, and then they decide. And they are serious about that. It's well-known NGOs. So again, we are going to this power dynamic relation about identifying the needs. So again, how we go to identify the needs. Who developed these tools? How we do analysis. Just now I calculate if we want to take a needs from someone in the street until we reach the donor how many levels we want. We want 7 levels. From the person in the street to the CBOs, then to the NGOs, then to the INGOs, then maybe the government, and then to the donors. So what happened in all this process? What will change? And then the program returned back to the community. So during all this process, a lot of things missing. So this is from one side. The other side, and this is a discussion that I have it with Maria and Lourdes and Leila about who we are as a local people. So if they choose me as someone who speaks English, I study in Europe University, so I am shocked about Western culture, and return back, I feel like, this is the good culture that I came. So how then I will decide the needs for my community? So I am, as a local person, who I am really feel like I'm proud about this Western culture, that everything is open, clean, clear. Then how I'm returning back to my culture, identifying the needs and decide what's good and bad for my community, and then between 2 brackets and the local person who identified the needs. So we are with this all complication, and we should be aware about it. I don't have answers, I know that, but just we put this question to think about it before saying that we participate, integrated the local community while we identifying the needs, and the people decided that this is their needs under that 3 lines. So not, I think, people, they don't know what is going on. And now, when I come to speak about the Palestinian experience, I will speak about that more in details. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shadi. We'll end this first session around naming the issue with Nancy Barron. So over to you, Nancy.
You're a hard act to follow, everybody. Your talks were brilliant, yeah? And Shadi, I follow what you're saying about what's local. You know, if for me, when I worked in a camp, it was easy. You know, when I was in a camp, it was clear. These are the people who I'm supposed to help. The community that surrounded them was easy, and maybe even the government. But now I'm in an urban area, you know, and it's not clear at all. When I first got to Cairo, we had 45,000 refugees, primarily 8 nationalities, and now we have 750,000 refugees, 8 to 9 million migrants, and 60 nationalities. Who's local? When you try to set up a program, what in the world are we talking about? You know, who is actually local? Where I am, you know, local, you know, neighborhoods From neighborhood to neighborhood is local. Nationality to nationality is local. Tribe to tribe is local. Different ethnic groups, different religions, the motivation of certain community leaders, economics, class, and also where I am is that actually money determines it. If you happen to be from one nationality rather than another, and you've been in Egypt a certain length of time, there's more money available and resources available than if you're not. So in many countries, local also includes government. Yeah, but in today's times, it's very complicated. We live in a global world that is not necessarily receiving refugees and people from other countries particularly well. So do we still include government? Do we still include national people? I think that varies from country to country, and it's not as easy as one thinks. I think it's all too easy for a very well-intentioned MHPSS program to actually set up activities thinking that they're doing one thing and ending up not respecting the multiple nationalities and communities that are there and actually setting up something that can be dangerous. In my experience in Cairo, localized programming is safest when we use local integration of refugees within their own community, within their own neighborhoods, within their own tribal groups, and each has this kind of unique system of where that localization should be. In fact, it's not safe a lot of times to just say that local means a greater community than that. Tribal conflicts, political tensions, violence, fear follow refugees. They're also in the urban context. There's a reason to not be able to just openly use local communities. Localization requires a full community engagement. Right? Full community engagement. However, I don't know, where I am, the willingness of communities to sometimes help their most vulnerable has become limited because the resources are limited. They can't even afford to help themselves, let alone to help other people. Right? They get frightened that they might be stuck with the vulnerable. They believe that somehow the UN and NGOs are actually the ones responsible, and they resent the fact that we're asking for community support. It's a strange twist. Yeah? So in conclusion, for me, who's local? I mean, I think it's very complicated. I think that before we can actually start any MHPSS intervention, we need to be very clear about who is local for that context, right? And that determination will help us to set up the interventions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thanks for all our panelists and all the inputs we got. I mean, probably we'll have the opportunity to wrap up at the end of the day, but just a few reflections about what I heard. I mean, it was interesting to hear that we are discussing about, centering the children in the discourse and in this question. We also hear about the rise of more and more standardization, but at the same time, the need for indigenous knowledge. And at the same time, we heard several of you spoke about breaking the binary approaches to all those questions. It's not just black and white, and that there's need to be some places to see, but at the same time it requests radical shifts, right? So there's all this tension that needs to be, that is a lot about movement, right, in this field, and a lot about questions that needs to be asked before being able to be answered, right? So maybe...
And spaces to discuss these questions.
Exactly. maybe we can open the floor now for questions for our panelists after this first session, before we break for a short
We know that there are
break.
not online questions, so we will open the floor here. There is one online, so we go first with our online audience. Yeah.
Yes, okay.
Yes.
I'm going to read the question because it's just posted. Given your emphasis on empowering local professionals to take ownership of interventions, should we prioritize implementing specific interventions before transferring power? Do local professionals have the necessary capacity to provide services aligned with protection mainstreaming, particularly within diverse communities and regions? Is it feasible to develop general guidelines for international actors to guide their interventions in such contexts? It's not directed to any panelist in particular, so it's a generic question. And actually there are three questions in this one.
So I don't know if any of you wants to come in.
There were too many questions for me to actually remember. I'll go with the one that that struck me, which is a question of competence. And I think we have to reverse that question and ask about the competence of people from not within communities, not familiar with local dynamics to intervene. How do I say this nicely? But over the last 28 years or so of the work that I've done in Sri Lanka, the number of times that really lovely people with good intentions who know nothing about what has worked or not worked, sometimes on a small scale, sometimes on an industrial scale. After the 2004 December tsunami, we had an influx. The district I helped coordinate MHPSS service, we call them psychosocial services at that time, before, this is pre-guidelines. We had 70 different groups just in one district, just doing psychosocial stuff in 6 months for a population of 500,000 people. And a large proportion of them are people from outside of, run from outside of Sri Lanka. Some people didn't know that we had a war on. Some people were working with conflict-affiliated actors but didn't know that. People didn't know what had worked and what had not worked previously. And this was true for international actors, but it was also true for national actors. And sometimes when we tried to say, well, before you come and do your program, would you like to come and visit? And we were shut down. Right? There are these, so the question is, people very seldom ask about the competence in the local context, the knowledge of the past, the knowledge of how systems work, how government works. Why capacity building initiatives over decades have not actually left any lasting legacy when we do the same thing again and again, right? So I think my response is yes, there are competence needs, but the competence, there's plenty of space for greater competence all around. The question is, where do we start from, and who's going to be there in the longer term, and who has a stake? And this is not to minimize the fact that within, as Nancy pointed out, the local is not, maybe local is not a good word, because it is very flattening, it is very simplifying. We have stakeholders who are embedded in context, who are embedded in hierarchies locally, and some of the relationships are not just local, but they're center periphery within a context, across class, across other types of privilege, and then also between people who are situated in a context and a university in the global north. And those dynamics are important to be aware of. And just the nature of your identity doesn't also predetermine what kind of work you're capable of doing. There can be incredible solidarity and sensitivity in work across differences of identity, but this can also be quite the opposite.
Thank you, Ananda. And thank you for that question. It is a very important question. And the contribution that I would like to make is we need to pay attention to qualification and skill. So what happens at times is that the advertisement goes, we want a psychologist or a mental health practitioner with a degree in this, a master's in this, a PhD in this. Yes, they have it. They have had the education. But then we also have people with the know-how, they can do the work, they've been, but they have not had the mainstream education, the colonial way of being taught. So, and I think that having a balance, a marriage between the two is very important, that the educationally qualified person works with the people or with the person with the know-how, the skill, the experience, the insight, so that there is a cross-learning and a partnership. So how that would then work in local areas in context. So local is the place. This is a local place. But in this local place, there is context. What is the context that we are working in? What are the issues that are surfacing in this place? How are we understanding the children in this local area in context? Meaning the languages, the cultures, the exposures, that is a contextual understanding of what's going on in that localization. So back to the other point on what do we mean by localization? My understanding of that is local, the place, and context, how we arrive there and how we work. So a balancing of the qualification and the actual know-how for me is important. When we are saying that we are wanting people to work with children in war zones, do they understand how to engage with the multiple victimizations that are happening on a singular child in one setting at the same time? Does that mental health worker understand how to work with that child in the context of that child's experience in that local area? So it is a balancing, right? It is a collaboration. It is a valuing of how everybody can inform how we support children, their families, and their backgrounds.
Thank you. And we have one question in the room.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you to all the panelists for this wonderful discussion. My name is Pratit. I'm a child rights activist, and I'm also a student of humanitarianism, and that's where two of my questions are particularly stemming from, is that when we look at humanitarianism in general and attach it with critical theory, one thing that often stems up is this context of localization itself. And as you mentioned, that, the local context, it's in itself very restricted to hierarchies, as in when, humanitarian workers reach the field and the way that they interact on the field is governed by ideas of race, by ideas of hierarchy, who gets access first. And particularly true in diverse communities where, there's so many different groups and these groups find themselves in so many different hierarchies. How does one grapple with this hierarchy, particularly on the field, when we go there and this localization itself is characterized by, say, dominant interests of one particular community, which is at a higher hierarchy than the other? How does one grapple with that? My second question is more centered on the idea of mental health and psychological support. Is that, and particularly for children and young people, this idea of mental health support, this idea of resilience is to an extent romanticized and very glorified. And this glorification stems from an idea of benevolence. How does one break this barrier and structure, which is sort of constantly grappling the larger mental health movement in terms of this idea of benevolence, this idea of glorification of resilience, particularly as sort of humanitarian worker or as someone who's working in the field?
So who wants?
Thank you so much. I'll take the second one. Children in crisis are surviving. They are not resilient. Being resilient means that you have the tools already and you are then using those tools to push yourself into a better way of living. These children don't have tools. They don't have tools. they are surviving with the little that they have done. So resilience is not surviving. I mean, resilience is not a positive thing for children in crisis, for children facing hardships, for children in trauma, for children being abused. They are not resilient. It isn't that those children are not seeing or being stretched to become better versions of themselves. No. They are surviving every day, fighting every day to live. So resilience for me has even become a swear word, because it is gaslighting children. So no, they are surviving, not resilient.
Thank you, Neziswa. I would like to speak to your first question. Thank you. So what I gathered, how to grapple with hierarchies within the local. It's something that I think many of the speakers have spoken to. My answer to that would be that there's a lot of insights around how to think critically about power relationships and to avoid, the word that you used, romanticization. And I think that, so interestingly enough, TDH at the moment has been doing a piece of work for a few years, which I've had the privilege to be part of, which is actually going back to some of the teachings of, scholars like Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, thinking about power, thinking about, and thinking about how can we, bring back some of these ideas into the work that we do with children, and into the work that we do with communities. And so we're currently working on this, power-informed analysis framework. But also, I think what's really critical is that, so when we look at, power-informed or tools and resources, and there's a few out there, there's Gaventus Power Cube, and there's different frameworks for power analysis. But when we look at then, how could we use these in designing projects, in doing a situation analysis, in doing strategic planning, in thinking about, if we want to involve different groups of children in governance structures in our organizations. But I think I think it's critical to always think about power and analyzing power, but importantly, it's important to keep ourselves in the frame of the analysis. And I think that's what's kind of the shift, is that it's not just that sort of, and I think that's what's come out in some of our discussions and the critiques of, this positivist approach that comes with kind of Western science, is that kind of we're over here, we have expertise and we're neutral. And we kind of look at the world over there and we kind of analyze the world, but we're not part of that and we don't influence that. Now, I think that a lot of the critiques of, indigenous scholarship that have said, well, look, that's, and decolonial scholarship, that's not really reality. We're all involved in social relations. We're all products of, we are products of power relationships ourselves, and we are enmeshed in power relationships. So when we think about using power analysis in our, in programming, I think we have to consider ourselves as much as the outside world. And then the critical question becomes, can we involve children and young people also in power-informed analyses? How do we do that? How do we equip ourselves with the language to involve them meaningfully in co-creating power-informed analyses that can inform power-informed approaches?
Thank you. If I could just return to what Neziswa was saying earlier. I think in this tension between addressing the sources of suffering versus the consequences, I think the challenge we often have is that the lack of power and actual agency that we have to change things. And I think we have to separate that from, so the humanitarian discourse and the industry and the whole machine likes to speak in very kind of grand terms, right? And promises about what we are doing. And yet, we know that what is done through the humanitarian enterprise, as much as we, might dedicate our lives to it and work so hard on it, we sometimes make a difference in people's lives, but very often we make a little difference in very few people's lives, right? And we don't change some of the things that really matter. And we're just one of many, many actors. Very often it's, it's people in your family, people, your friends, other people in communities who are doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And none of all these people doing all this stuff to try and make life better often make things better. They help survive, right? And so I think we have to balance. I think the thing for us is to think about what is it that we claim to do and what is it that we are satisfied with doing. I think sometimes we have to help people adapt and cope with and survive terrible things, and we leave people will remain harmed and damaged, and they will carry the legacy of that for the rest of their lives. And that is the reality of the world that we live in at one level. But that does not mean that we get to say, oh, they survived, that's great, that they must be resilient. It is not to say that we cannot then absolve ourselves of the attempt to try and address those underlying, the things that really determine outcomes. So I think it's a hard thing to, in a context where we have to, the discourse and the attempt to gain funding, to gain recognition, visibility, cover oneself in glory, that whole thing results in, I think, a very distorted sense of what we actually do. It's important, but it's not. We're not miracle workers. We're on the other end of the spectrum. We're making minor changes. They're really important, but we need to do more. But we need to recognize it, I think.
Thank you very much. As we are a little bit late, so if any of you have some questions, we're going to have another question and answer at the end of the morning. So if it's okay with you, can we just bring this question at the end of the session? So we take now a 10 minutes break, and we'll come back here in 10 minutes. So introducing this second session. So we had. We went through, discussion about some of the underlying issues to power imbalance and dynamics. We tried to name some of this issue. And now we are going to be trying to discuss a little bit how they are being experienced and seen on the field, and look at challenges and successful factors for power transformation. So I'm first calling Shadi to come up on the stage and share his experience with us.
Okay, thank you. So the sound is good. Do you hear me? So I will speak about localization and mental health in the Palestinian context. So I think it's a very difficult task to talk about Palestinian and present story. This is not an easy mission, but I will try to do it. So, okay. No, the other side, the other way around. Other way? Okay. Yeah. So first, we need to speak about history. This is the context. So what is the history of the Palestinian? So for us, we know when the suffering started, but we don't know when that will end. So it started in 1970, when some country decided that they will establish a country for the Jewish in our land. And then we can see what happened after that under these days. So we have a Nakba. This is very important time for us, where the majority of Palestinian or half Palestinian, they displaced outside Palestine. Then we can start to see that happened, the first and the second intifada, and between them we have peace agreement that now we know that it's not exist anymore. But the most important, that what happened in Gaza now, it connected. It's not happening only in the 7th of October. It started in 2007, when Gaza was under siege under these days. And they faced war in 2009, 12, 14, 19, and then we have the 2023. So this is the history of Palestine that is still and continue until now. So with this history, we can say that, because we're speaking about localization and mental health, that we work and we did a lot. It's not only about people coming from outside to help. Yes, we are under many difficult situations, but we are working. Since the early 20th century, we have organizations work in Palestine. They try to help, to support all levels of life, For example, in 1922, we have the first mental health psychiatric hospital in Bethlehem. And we have at the same time the first women club. And we have many, many, many organizations. They continue to work and support. Between the 1987 and 94, because we don't have government, and we have the first intifada, where Palestinians struggle and for liberation for their rights, we have many communities established to help Palestinians in all levels of life. So they try to support the fabric of the Palestinian to stay connected, to make sure that services are available, that people are supported. But after that, we have also agreement and establishing the Palestinian Authority. So we start to see the fund coming to the NGOs and to the Palestinian Authority. So the relation between the organization and the people start to change a little bit since the funding came. So we start to see that organizations are using standardized models. We don't have it before. Before people, they go to the street, they ask about the needs, they think how to bring the needs. Before that, we have BFA without knowing that this is called BFA. Because people, when someone dies, people go for that, prepare the food, taking care of the family, being with them at least 40 days. This is the culture. Then we start to see organizations calling for standardized approaches. They become more professional. They speak other languages. And people, they start to think and to talk about the relation between what they are doing and the global agenda and the regional agenda. So just to put the thing in the context or in the frame, what's happening at what is doing until now. So to speak about mental health and psychosocial in Palestine, and to go to there. So first of all, that we should to say that psychology is not always neutral. We see how psychology is used against us and against other nations. It's clear, we'll not go to that, but we know that sometimes, and many times, psychology is used against us to analyze the Palestinian mother as someone who's not stable according to some culture practice that she did. This is how psychology analyzes how women mother deal with death for their sons or daughters. So we saw that, but let's go to understand what's going with mental health. So first, to speak about trauma, we are not speaking about normal trauma. We saw trauma, it's moving from generation to other until these days. So trauma started in 1948 until now. So how we understand, how we explain, how we deal with this trauma. Okay? So, and the trauma, of course, impacts all aspects of our life. This is part of our life. It's part of our behavior, social fabric, and well-being. So, understanding Palestinian mental health requires knowledge that understand the collective identity. And this is part of our identity, that we are collective, we are living together, and the group and the family and the big family are very important. Of course, the individual is important, but still, there's collective identity for the Palestinian. So how we understand this situation, using the other theories that don't work. Many Palestinian scientists came and talk about that. One of them is Marwan Dweri. He's a well-known cross-cultural psychologist. He speaks about we can't use the only Western theories to explain what's going in Palestine, in the same time that these theories based on the observation in the Western. We have two different cultures, two different contexts, two different situations. We can't just bring these theories and explain what is going on. We need other science, other knowledge. Okay? So if we want to understand the Palestinian situation, the Palestinian context, the well-being, the mental health, we need to think about the values, the culture, that people live in Palestine according to that. So the collective identity is very important to understand the relation between the collective national identity and coping with the situation that happened. So we go to the word resilience, okay. That we saw that came to analysis and understand the situation in Palestine. This is one of the things that happened, that people want to understand what's happening in mental health and well-being. So we saw the word resilience. And resilience, as we saw, it's about cope, adapt, using tools to move on in your life. So for us, sometimes this is not explain the whole story, but we saw that many mental health specialists in Palestine, they are happy with this word. But others, they say, no, it's not resilience. Resilience is part of that. We have other thing. We have other thing than resilience. We call it as-sumud. And this is Arabic word, mean steadfastness. Okay? As-sumud, this is the word that can explain what's happening with us. And as-sumud is the idea of Palestinian, the art of living, how you live in this situation. We live in this situation since 100 years. How you live in this situation, you still live, you still doing what you are doing. So this is the word that we use. Resilience part of that, but resilience can't explain everything. So Palestinians now, they start to push and to talk about the sumud. And the sumud, it's about building and rebuilding your home despite of the demolition of this home. There are some homes demolished many times. Palestinians, they return back and they build it again. Why they do that? Why Palestinians, they still go to work, they cross the checkpoint, or they find alternative to checkpoint, and they enjoy their time. They have cultural event in the situation where they have all the struggle, because this is a sumud. And there's different level of the sumud. I will not go through it now, but if you'd like, read about it. There's the first level, the second level of the sumud. Okay? So a sumud is the word that reflects what is going with us. So I think I have 1 minute, and 1 minute I will say about what we should to do, okay, with that. So this is the message for you and for everyone. So first, if you want to understand the mental health and the well-being of the Palestinian, you should understand the history, the collective identity, and the sumud. And then we'll start to talk about how we can build the approach. So for us, learning is not learning about us. First, you need to learn about yourself, who you are. As someone come from outside to Palestine, who's your values, attitude when you are dealing with us as Palestinian. First, learn about yourself. Then we can talk and speak about how you'll help us. Then you will start to understand our culture and community. From that, we can start, and I will end with one word for Fanon, who said, okay, decolonization is truly the creation of new men. And we're not meaning us, we're meaning someone else. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shadi. I think that it was quite powerful. I think that the idea of sumud is something that we're going to be all reading about, I think, trying to, but it was really, I think that the ending also with this word is really also showing us how supporting the survival of others also needs, you know, us to decolonize the practice. Thank you very much. So we're going to hear now from Nancy, Patrick? Patrick, I think. Yes, Patrick. So can we have Patrick with us? Hi, Patrick, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Very well. Over to you.
I want to put... Can you see my slide? I have one slide.
Yes, we can see. Just put it in presentation mode, maybe, and you can start.
Yes. I hope that's okay now.
Yeah.
So I'll start by sharing some of the successes and difficulties we have encountered and that have been part of navigating for the years I've been involved in this field. And I'll begin by sharing an experience that I had many, many years ago in the early 2000s. We were responding to a huge displacement and influx of refugees from South Sudan and conflict in northern part of the country. And we went into this meeting, the government through the ministry responsible convened actors, and I think they had identified funding. We had donors in this room. We had people from the education sector, from the health sector, nutrition, water and sanitation. And we were asked, what did we want to do? And what measures and indicators did we have to, were we going to apply? The education team, of course, had enrollment, retention, and completion, very clear, concise. The health had their very clear indicators. HIV/AIDS, they had very clear indicators, and everybody else. When it came to mental health and psychosocial support, we asked, how many units of psychosocial support are you going to deliver per child? And we had economists in the room and health economists said, how many units of psychosocial support does a child who has experienced these difficulties need to recover? And we just couldn't explain it. And I recall vividly someone coming up later in the room and saying, we should stop thinking that you can give a ball to a group of kids and think that you're having impact. And that's just illustrative of how we have navigated the sector. And from that time, we tended to look at mental health, provision of mental health as a single issue intervention. It became difficult, first of all, to win, to get the appreciation and support of local actors. Many donors that we approached at that time, and especially if you're talking of children, there was this whole thought that the mental health of children don't suffer as much mental health. You give them a stable home, give them protective environments, and they'll thrive, which is never true. So we navigated some of those difficulties from the onset by identifying the sectors within which we then embarked on mainstreaming and integrating psychosocial. Some of the sectors we've worked within until today include the child protection sector. It was easier for us to provide justification why survivors of violence needed psychosocial support. The child protection sector was receiving more funding, and it was easier for us to find inroads, to build inroads through that. Livelihoods as well. In one district, I recall, we went in and we were putting these women together, survivors of immense violence and conflict and so on. But the justification we provided was, if you intervene in the livelihoods needs of displaced women and communities in particular, you're directly improving their mental and psychosocial well-being. And so that is the approach that we rolled out, including working in schools, promoting safer school environments, working with education folks, and emphasizing the contribution of a safe school environment to the mental well-being of children. So we long moved away from delivering MHPSS as a single issue. Secondly, in pretty much most of Africa, the mental health is really looked at as a primary health concern. Each time we went into these meetings, we frequently asked, and the capacity issue came up, I think it was Shadi who was talking, we frequently asked, how many psychiatrists do you have on your team? Well, we have, so what numbers are you talking about? And then you'd say, we're talking about 10%, and then 3% of those 10%. So it didn't seem viable at all to draw interest of the planners at that time. And this significantly limited opportunities for us to collaborate with government. It was very expensive to try or even attempt to bring on our team. These professionals were very expensive. The cost of having a psychologist, first of all, not even psychiatrists or clinical psychiatric officers, because you're depriving the public health system as an NGO. But the cost of employing one psychologist could get you about 5 social workers who you could train to do outreach and so on. And that's how we then started introducing community outreaches. We scaled back a lot more on working with facilities, integrating into health facilities, and we engaged communities through community outreaches to create demand for the service. Our health system is demand-driven. If you generate demand at community level, the health service and the health facilities will then provide the medicines that are needed. They will then train staff and deploy more clinicians to attend to these issues. So I think that was really strategic for us. And until now, we still do the community outreaches. We have integrated psychoeducation, home-based care, and so on. And over the years, we've seen the appreciation of the facility-based service providers of this approach. Governments, as we know, as several people have mentioned, you can't talk localization without engaging government. There's a lot of apprehension now between local national authorities and NGOs, whether they are local NGOs or international NGOs. In REPSSI, where I work, we operate in 13 countries. In those countries, we have registered as local organizations in most of them. But we still face a lot of apprehension. Our relationship is always ambivalent. So they think, national authorities tend to think, you're coming in to do what? Who gives you the mandate to do these things? So integration is extremely important, but also understanding localization in the context of these power centers and how these power centers are interpreted by the different actors. So we saw ourselves as coming to fill a gap while it's building capacity. And until now, a significant proportion of MHPSSs and emergencies is delivered by NGOs. But we have a lot has said over the years with the introduction of and support to the mental health working groups in the country. We have seen improvements in coordination. We've seen linking and learning across local actors and INGOs. There's a growing number of INGOs who really appreciate the need to recognize that they cannot go in and do things the way they were always doing them, and therefore emphasize collaboration with local actors. So there are lots of good things, cross-learning, and then continually being called upon to deliver technical assistance is an ongoing process. The major MHPSS system strengthening, we saw that kind of contributed to community activism. We had, when you go into a community, you map existing community structures. They understand their needs very clearly, and who is better placed to articulate those needs than the communities themselves. In the early years, we would go and speak on behalf of communities. But now we mobilize communities, and they go and present manifestos to their local leadership. They present memorandums to the duty bearers who are supposed to provide these services. So it's more or less like movement building. You're building a very small but consistent movement of activists who demand the services. And then some of that is then used by us, the practitioners, to develop policies and work with the policymakers and ensure that the work we're doing at community level finds its way into policy, which is more sustainable. We have recent experiences where we have been looking at what are the mental health needs of child survivors of sexual abuse. And when we did the policy analysis, out of the 8 countries, only 1 had integrated child sexual abuse prevention as a key area of attention within either health or community development. So that kind of work is very impactful, working with the policy level, using data-driven prevalence monitoring and reporting, and then empowering communities to demand services themselves. Communities can speak on for themselves. And lastly, a lot of the work we do and that I've been talking about has its foundation in some of the early interventions we developed with Dr. Nancy Baron, who is here on the panel. Nancy and I worked together for a very, very long time, setting these things up and transitioning. That time I was working with TPO Uganda, transitioning our programs from an often focus on Western science approaches to community and family-centered approaches that are more sustainable and adaptable. Yeah, so that's really what I wanted to share. The field, as far as localization, is also depriving local actors of knowledge. I think looking at INGOs in the context of learning some of the work that MHPSS Collaborative is doing, linking us to knowledge centers in the global north and so on is still very important given some of the resource constraints that we encounter. Thank you very much, and I'll just pause there for now.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Yeah, I think this was great to hear on the discussion today the link with community and government work and system building, because yeah, localization is not just only about working with communities and families, but it's also ensuring that ultimately it's grounded also within the systems we work with. So I'm going to give the floor now to Nancy. That was just mentioned by Patrick, as they worked with Patrick a long time ago. Over to you.
We miss you here, Patrick. I'm going to talk more personally. And so for the past 35 years, I've lived and worked in locations with populations experiencing violence. First for 5 years in Asia, then for 15 years around, with countries across Africa and the Balkans, and for the past 15 years in Egypt. I entered the international field with a predetermined bias towards community-based, localized interventions. My education as a psychologist was particularly as a family therapist with a systemic holistic thinking. And in my early career in the United States, I was involved in the movement of closing institutions for people who were juvenile offenders, people who had mental illness. So I began my international career already believing in localized community-based interventions. In my early years in international work, I was surrounded, however, by Western professionals promoting trauma treatment and believing that people across the world affected by wars and other emergencies needed Western-styled psychiatric care and counseling. I always disagreed with this. Ananda, I appreciated some of the names up on the wall. That I always disagreed with this, and my personal challenge from the beginning and across the years has been how to promote localized, practical community programming using local teams and showing that they are effective. As an elder in our international field, today I want to share some of the lessons that I've learned that have allowed me to feel okay about the obvious contradiction of being a Western professional promoting community-led localized programming. My lesson 1, which has been confirmed over and over, is about humility. As an educated and experienced Western professional, sure, I have certain knowledge and expertise that can be helpful, but I believe it's my years of experience that far outweigh anything I ever learned in school. Essential throughout my years has been to admit and be open about what I don't know. We as Western professionals didn't invent the essential roots of helping and compassion that underlie our work, and this was begun by communities for generations. Knowing that, I've asked lots and lots of questions, and I listen closely to hear what I don't know, and then try to respond accordingly. Designing interventions is certainly not about me being smart and right, but rather about me hearing what local people need, what local people know, listening to what historically is useful, and then advocating to get them what they need to help themselves. Regularly we say, I want to help people to help themselves. However, I often ask myself, do we really mean this? Since today we are revisiting ideas about the value of localized programming that we've actually been talking about for the last 20 years. As I prepared this talk, I kept thinking about why. Why, if we believe what we're talking about today, why hasn't it become fully operationalized? One reason can be that localized program design is not always about what we at Western professionals might think is best. We should be advocating for what local communities think is best. How often is it that 5 years after we return to a previous work site that we can't find our MHPSS interventions? The question is why? I think that's exactly what we're talking about in this meeting. Are the programs that we design not sustained because there isn't any money to sustain them? I don't think so. I think, or is it the local will to sustain the interventions is not there because the interventions didn't go along with what was best in the first place for the culture, the context, and the resources of the local people. Unfortunately, we don't always know when we're localized or not because the localized population doesn't always tell us. As a Western person in a foreign world, our local colleagues are polite, they smile, they thank us, and they take lots of pictures. They accept what we offer because we're from the West, and no matter how nice and open we try to be, we've come to their tragedy on a contract with a plan, with a pre-designed strategies, pre-designed indicators, activities, and a budget. Do they truly have a choice when we hold the money and the influence? And often, unfortunately, the national urban professionals are also trained in Western techniques and promote them alongside of us. They too can miss the components of what's needed to be localized because they're not always part of the local community that actually needs our help. Over the years, I've been the designer and a cooperator in many different types of MHPSS interventions. I have found that localization is most possible when the helping people are from the same cultures, speaking the same languages, and living alongside of the people they'll help. Sure, it's complicated, but it works best because it's this helping that will be most clearly localized. These interventions are by the people, for the people, and helping is a sincere commitment that comes from workers assisting their own people because they want to, not just because it's a job that they get paid to do. I remember learning that lesson first in Uganda. I was hired in 1996 as a foreign expert to work with the national and refugee team to provide an MHPSS program to South Sudanese refugees. I'd never been to Africa. I'd never been to Uganda. I didn't even know where South Sudan was on the map, and I certainly didn't understand the culture nor the people. But I was an educated Western professional with 5 years of MHPSS experience in Asian conflicts, and that made me a hired expert. I was like many of the MHPS experts that we're sending out into the field today. When I arrived, I found a Ugandan MHPSS program that had begun, as Patrick described, primarily with this Western model of trauma treatment. And over the 6 years that I was there, and Patrick and I worked together, we transitioned from a trauma treatment model to valuing and recognizing the basis of community-based work. We hired and trained a team of refugees, designed local community interventions, purchased a pack of motorcycles so the team could traverse the huge refugee camp area, and we also brought in national Ugandan psychiatric nurses and medication so that the north of Uganda could have what was already in the capital. As the intervention model transitioned, so did the commitment to move from an international NGO to a national NGO. The greatest transition was to modify the power and the influence of the Western experts to a national and refugee team. I was replaced by Patrick, our previous speaker. Why was this transition possible? Well, for us, it was clear that Patrick, as a national expert, had a far greater understanding and capacity to localize that program into national systems than I did. I could see my limitations and his possibilities. To make the program's intervention part of a long-lasting change, we needed to ensure that our work had a local base, and Patrick and his national and refugee team offered this. This program followed that course of national needs and is now 30 years old. So what are we discussing today? So what we're discussing today is not new. We learned lessons about sustainable community intervention in Uganda in 2002. Now, after I left Uganda, I spent 6 years traversing global emergencies, training, designing, and evaluating programs. I went to Egypt because I wanted to take everything I'd learned and put it in an urban context where we actually did not have models. Now, after being in Egypt for 15 years, I look back on the years that I did short-term work, and I wonder what became of it. I've learned that there's a tremendous value in being in the same country in the same program for 15 years. In Egypt, I've become part of what is the local context for refugees. All right? I know the history of the country and of refugees, and with confidence, I can say that the situation there now is worse than it's ever been because I've seen the change. I've witnessed the cultures of the beneficiaries. I've witnessed the cultures of the beneficiaries, so I can advocate effectively However, no matter how long I am in Egypt, no matter how long I work with various refugee cultures, I will never be local. Local people can build community systems that can safely help their own people. They can do this. I can't. I can only facilitate it. Today, we're promoting localized interventions and recognizing the limitations and risk that accompany the power of the West. Today, we should walk away feeling confident that we're promoting and what is wonderful, and change should be forthcoming. Sadly, it's not that easy. Since many of these ideas are not new, we must look closely at what continues to prevent them from taking hold. One recent response that others have mentioned is about global tools that are being set up and used to standardize and professionalize our field. These tools are giving all the field of MHPS new workers a greater ease in designing interventions and determining its impact. Our donors and our humanitarian institutions demand this. And I give tremendous credit to my colleagues who've designed this multitude of tools. To their credit, every tool begins with localize it. It's important that you localize this tool and modify it to your context. But the big question is, do we do that? Importantly, do we do it? Or don't we do it because we don't know how? Or do we just accept that a group of professionals designed it and actually they must know what's best? And frankly, in emergencies, it's quickest and most efficient to use the tools just as people send them to us. But with standardized tools that are not contextualized, Sudan and Gaza will use the same tools to design community interventions despite being so different. So do we run the risk of standardizing local community programming because of our tools and our institutional rules? Okay. Anyone who is part of a localized initiative recognizes how hard it is to keep it localized. Our systems, our donors, our professional requirements are intended to monitor and evaluate our impact and keep us honest and cost-effective. It's all necessary. However, these same safeguards can stifle our localized initiatives. To allow localized programs to finally flourish, what do we need? Well, we need first to be aware of what's holding us back. We need to educate our MHPSS workforce how to localize these standardized tools and to actually understand what localized and community intervention is all about. We clearly need to advocate to our donors and to our own institutions to be flexible for things like finance and reporting. They have to respect local community capacities. They have to truly want local community initiatives that are creative, innovative, and contextualized. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that we have to recognize an amazing diversity in the different experience we heard about from Patrick, Shadi, and Nancy. We are a bit late, so I'm going to give the floor maybe directly to our other colleagues to just react and complement some of the things that were said by our colleagues. So I don't know who wants to go first.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Shadi, and thank you, Nancy. I want to hone in on what Patrick has spoken about on the issue of coordination of services, that the services that respond to the crisis must work hand in hand. The healthcare, the mental health care, the education and feeding, those, if those don't talk hand to hand, if they don't speak with each other and create a pathway of ensuring that if a child has been seen by SEPS, by the law for anything, maybe they had been raped, maybe they had been hit, after that case has been recorded, what is the next step? Is the next step then healthcare worker? Are they aware of that? Are they recording it? Are they sending the child then to the next place? A healthcare worker? Are they then sending them to the next place, maybe where they can get food and support? Are they then sending that child next to whatever it is, a housing environment, a school environment? So the coordination of services is very important. And then a trauma-informed response is very important again. A trauma-informed, it means that the officials, the practitioners that will care for that child, do they know how to work with a child that is facing such abuses, such traumas? Are they aware, are they about what they can potentially do to aggravate the trauma of that child? So a trauma-informed response and is something that we have to be aware of. And also, the people working with kids, have they been made aware of biases that they hold? Are we aware that they themselves are affected as well? Because they are also part of this. They are seeing everything, they are feeling everything, they are experiencing everything. They are flesh and blood. So they are impacted. So a trauma-informed, coordinated system of responding to the needs of kids in the environments that they are in is something that I think we need to highlight and emphasize.
Thank you. I won't take too long because I think it's nice to go to discussion as well, but I would just like to pick up on what came out of all three of the presentations, and which actually goes back to something that came up in the first question, which again is, what is the local and what is not, and those tensions that we hold. Something that you said, Nancy, that stuck in my mind is, no matter how long I've been in Egypt, I will never be local. And I think that's obviously there's an element of truth, but I think then the question is, and then so what is one who is in a place for such a long time? And also then again, what if we're not local, then what are we? And this comes back to what you said, Ananda, in the previous set, is that maybe we need to kind of unpack this idea of local and actually think about, what did you say, multiple stakeholders who are contextualized in relation. And I think this is really important, because this idea of this relationality, and this touches on what you were also just speaking about, Neziswa, is that I think that if we start to think more in terms of the relationalities in INGO programming, or NGO programming, or how is it? And it touches on what I was saying before in response to Pratit's question about power, is that actually, again, we're all formed through and we're all part of these power relationships. And so I think part of the unpacking the problematic use of the term localization, I think, comes around thinking more relationally. And I'm going to stop there because I think...
Thank you. No, I'm not going to pick on that. I think that's a great point. And that might be the way through, understanding the quality and the nature of those relations, and the web that it produces, the effects that it produces. I just want to say that the last three speakers remind us that the work that we're trying to do for the whole field has been done, is constantly going on. But it's not in the spotlight. It's not on the main page. It doesn't make it into our presentations about the state of the field. When you say, here is the repertoire of tools that we don't have these kinds of approaches that are built for and evolved for a particular context. And I think that's the big problem we have, which is that it is not that there is just a monochrome field out there, but we have actually a part of the field that is in shadow, is not acknowledged. People are continuing to work in ways that are responsive to communities, that are inventive, but they just don't get into the RCTs, they don't get into the peer-reviewed journals, they don't get written up at all, they're not in the evidence base, they're not in the repertoire of good practices, rarely. I mean, there are few exceptions. So I think that's something worth thinking about, and thinking about how we value this. And I think, I'd just like to say that, that I think we need mechanisms by which we can surface this kind of work, discuss it, get to hear about it, think about how do I, sitting in Sri Lanka, think about the kinds of concepts that are important to you, Shadi, and think about, well, not that we will have an analogous concept, but what are the concepts that people are using, and how do we center that in the construction of interventions, and not simply do, PFA again. So I'll just leave it there and pass on.
Thank you very much. And just wrapping up a few points that were very interesting, and actually we will see, because we will have some actionable recommendations, and before going also to the session of the questions and answers. Actually, you all mentioned in different ways also this difference between, and we make this difference, but we don't think it that much. And actually, how can, from an external point of view, we can really understand reality? And what do we need for that, which is the attitudes, as you all mentioned. And one thing is the knowledge that we have, and that is happening. I know what is resilience, and I know how to promote it. And that is knowledge, skills that are a bit empty, but what the attitudes and how do I really listen, what is resilience in certain contexts, because it's not only one. And then also something that you've been also all mentioning is how can we really think outside the box in our sector when we have all these very rigid boxes on measuring, on program cycling, and on all the resources. So all these elements, just to wrap up, because there were many different things said and that are very valuable. And if we wanted to suggest that we have a space for questions and answers, we have we have a question already here, and we have some questions online. If all our speakers do have we have some recommendations. So one idea, as we are a bit late in time, would be that we do share the recommendations, and then we have the whole space for questions and answers. So we do not do different timings in sessions, so we can wrap up all together. Does that sound good? Yes. So if you would like to. And of course, for the recommendations, there were some questions that we proposed after all these different interventions and thinking. So some questions that were proposed to our panelists, that then they will propose some actionable strategies or solutions that we have captured and collected.
Yeah, so we have been actually working in advance of this meeting with the panelists to try to generate and to identify, what would be some of the recommendations that would have at this stage, right? And so what I'm going to show now is, a first attempt of trying to compile what came out from our different speakers. And obviously, we will be further working on those, right, after the discussion today. And this is what I was mentioning earlier, that we will be able to share with you on the QR code that is on the little card, and online that will be shared, that will be disseminated probably a week after this meeting today, to have consolidated recommendations that we can share with you. Some of the questions that we have asked our speakers was, what changes are expected in the system and ways of working to embark on this journey of localization of MHPSS? Key do's and don'ts when supporting transformational power sharing and localization of MHPSS, and practical recommendation to support successful localization and power sharing. So what I'm going to do now is just, you have here and it's very small. So I'm just going to read out loud the big categories we have. We've got two recommendations that came out around centering local knowledge, and this came out very strongly on the first session, around local leadership in MHPSS program, and MHPSS response, linked with the local knowledge and the, drawing from global knowledge. This non-black and white as we discussed earlier. Another set of recommendations are around the sharing of power, navigating power dynamics, which requires a reflexive approach, and I think this has been said several times, linked with the positioning. Power sharing and community-led decision-making. And finally, obviously, something that has been coming back over and over, the need of flexibility in terms of finance management to allow the sharing of resources. So what we're going to do now, we're going to give the floor to the speakers to just elaborate maybe on some of the aspects of those recommendations. And obviously, again, we will be able to share those a bit more detail a week from now in a consolidated way.
But also actually taking into account the inputs from the different questions and answers that will come after, so we can shape these recommendations to be published in the site that we gave you the QR. So it will be a bit more comprehensive, and not only from here, but also hearing the inputs from everyone at the end. So that's why we will open also the floor. So we pass the floor to our speakers.
Yeah, thank you. For recommendation, I think we are still in the same place that we say, yes, local knowledge is important. It's there. We need just to look for it and use it, not to replace it. Not to replace it with another, as you said, standard application that's success to go to somewhere with evidence base. We still, as Bastien, we have a lot of documents that no one knows about it, about how to deal with a specific situation from mental health perspective. So local knowledge is important, taking into consideration the concept of the local people, not replace them. So when we say Nakbi and Samud, don't bring another word to explain what I feel. This is the word that's explain me, so please respect it. And the third recommendation that I will make, that's psychology and all the science should start to think about how dealing with the root of the problem, the causes, not stay in the surface, not help us only to cope. So we need to deal with inequality, not just helping people to live with inequality. Thank you.
Thank you. Patrick, it's disconnected, I think, so we'll keep going until he connects.
So I was just thinking about, the question of what is this on? Yeah. What does it take? What's it going to take? So it's going to take a lot, right? The process of us, actually moving towards something that looks like proper power sharing is going to take a long process. But it has to start with a recognition and acknowledgement of the structures, processes, perspectives, and I think crucially interests that produce inequalities between global north and global south actors, and also within the global north and within the global south. So I think we could start with an audit, right? A proper audit of power in the field from top to bottom, how it shapes what happens. I think we can also learn from other fields that have been doing this a bit more successfully than us, and I think particularly of the global feminist movement, and particularly global South feminist networks and organizations that are thinking about ways of working in solidarity, but also of rethinking funding and more processes for using money. And I think there's also the fact that change will not come without people. In every institution, it's people who shape and change the culture. And so I think, going back to your reference, Kristen Freire, a kind of conscientization of MHPSS practitioners and administrators around the question of power, and understanding it the way that, let's say, in relation to feminism, we think about patriarchy as a key concept to understand how power operates and ideology operates and is operationalized. I think we need an equivalent for MHPSS in some senses. I think we also have to think about who is in the room, where is the room, right? Where's the space? And also, who has the money? who decides how we use the money, how do we decide how the money is used. So, because I think ultimately this kind of power and inequality has a materiality to it. It is not just about words, it is about real difference and real things at stake.
Thank you, Ananda. And to bounce off that as well, I agree that I'd like to speak to the recommendation, which is the second one up there. Navigating power dynamics requires a reflexive approach. And I think that this, it has been acknowledged that there is a lack of reflexivity in our sector. And I think that we could do well to think about how do we foster reflexivity amongst child protection practitioners generally, also amongst MHPSS practitioners in international development and humanitarian contexts. And that requires, acknowledging the need to engage with power analysis and thinking critically about power relationships. And I think that then, this is just to go back to what I was saying in my initial address, I really think that there is it's timely for us to consider, if we take the critiques around saviorism in our sector seriously, I think it's timely to consider what comes after that, and what could it mean to move from saviorism to solidarity by examining what changes are needed across all levels. On my LinkedIn profile, since I opened my LinkedIn account about 6 or 7 years ago, I have the quote of a indigenous feminist activist from Australia, Lila Watson, and she says, quote, "If you've come here to help me, then you're wasting your time. But if you come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." And I'll always come back to that quote, and then I'll come back to that finally in relation to what was mentioned as well, is this idea of also language, and where does language sit? And how do we evolve and transform ourselves by being willing to learn new language? And Shadi, you shared with us this idea of resilience and then the concept of sumud and how that exists. And so I just would finish by also referring to the concept of, or the word for solidarity in Arabic, which is tadamun, and from the root damana, which also is it's based in the ideas of responsibility, of safeguarding, of inclusion. And so how can we also start to draw upon new languages, new concepts for our own self-transformation as part of this journey, and really, really acknowledging and dismantling power relations?
That's the last one. Yeah, it's okay. Yes. Okay, so I have sharing resources. I think that's what I'm going to talk about. I want to believe that this time we are serious about wanting to have localized community interventions. And so I think that institutions, I mean the UN, I mean NGOs, I mean international groups, as well as donors, I'd suggest need to put their money where their mouth is. Is that if these are the ideas we believe in, then we have to figure out how to support them, not just talk about them. All right, so I would suggest that in fact that we need systems that actually do that we need monitoring systems, reporting systems, financial systems. They're killing us. Right? And so those are not locally friendly. So we need to find ways that they're locally, community friendly and support what we're saying we believe in. And we also need to think about that this is long term. This isn't like work of, we have a year here, 2 years there, and 3 tomorrow. You can't build something if you don't have a long-term commitment. So that's what I hope for.
Thank you so much. I'd like to talk about power, but then I would like to address the ethical use of power. The ethical practice in how we share power. What are the gives? What are the takes? When do we use our voice? When do we not use our voice? When are we allies? When are we partners? So all of that is around power. there is a framework of power by and he talks about the power of knowledge. What kind of knowledge is considered actual knowledge, true, that it is and the issue around race, nationality, whether or not you are part of a place, are you belonging there or not, what informs that and who? Even for us, when are we part of this? When are we not? Who is part of this place? Who is not? What are the papers saying? What are they not? Even if people have papers or don't, are they not people? Are they not people? They are people, and it is a basic right that we serve them. But then the capital of it all, the agenda setting, the finances, the funder that says you must do A, B, C, or D, or else I won't pay for this. Then what is our voice and place in this? What are we then advocating for, and how? The issue around the subjective person, the subjective experiences of people, the ensuring that the realities are informing what we also do, and that it isn't a matter of where is the ethics in around saying that the model says A, B, C, and D, but I can see that it isn't fitting with you, but I will still do this because my director said. What about the ontology of people, and how are we using our power to then inform change? The next area of consideration around this issue of power and sharing is patriarchy, authority. Women can be patriarchal too by reinforcing patriarchal systems. Right? So how are we using the authority that we have around gender, gendering, sexualities, freedom of expression? How are we regulating people in the camps in which we work, their autonomy? What is informing our ethical practice, what we deem that as ethics? Spoken about power and authority, and then the exploitation of the land. We didn't speak about land issues, right? But the land, how the land is very much important for healing. When people are displaced, dislocated from their land, from their origin, and we are saying that we are supporting the mental health of those people. But land is attached to soul. So then how are we being there, contributing to the exploitation of people and the labor of the people of that land before we came and helped? The ethics of power, the ethics of how we use and exercise the power we do hold, because we have power.
Thank you very much. Patrick is still not online, so I think thank you very much for all your final remarks and recommendations. And we would like to open the floor for all the audience we have online and in person to both questions, but also remarks, additional recommendations that we would like that everyone can also input and for us to enrich all these recommendations that we were going to publish. We are going to take, exactly, the first question is the one that wait long.
Oh, so. That's okay. Thank you very much for these very inspiring discussions. We all know that aid in general is packed with subdued values, norms, cooked somewhere else, stereotypes, prejudices, etc., and well-intentioned flows. And probably charity is the worst word in the English vocabulary because I never use it. But and we operationally, when you are confronted to that kind of situation, you are in the middle of a lot of tensions, as you say. Rights versus duties, individual versus community, for example, individual judgments against loyalty to your community or your hierarchy, etc. Okay, we all agree with that. I was once in a country called Serendib, Sri Lanka, and we were fighting against torture, and torture was really massive and beyond good and evil. And the answer from the authorities, from the official, was said, this is not torture. Torture is part of our culture, And the people who say that were not coconut pickers, they were educated, British educated, who read Shakespeare at school, and this cultural argument comes from the elite, never from the masses. So my question is how do you arbitrate between universal, so-called universal values and specific culture, and where is the yardstick to decide what is legitimate and what's not? And that's the problem I experience all my professional life everywhere, Sri Lanka, Palestine, whatever, is exactly the same thing. How do you, I would say, legitimize your action? For example, in Somalia against genital mutilation, the same cultural argument will come to you. It's part of our culture, and cultures in crisis are very, very, very sensitive to, I would say, international or external interferences. So how do you, where is the algorithm to decide what is legitimate and what's not?
Thank you for that. I think it is a core challenge, and I would say, sadly to say that torture is still very normalized in routine policing in Sri Lanka. But also, if you look at the roots of those practices, for example, where did we learn them from? It was a part of colonial policing. I have a late relative who was quite senior in the police, who I learned, was trained to perform a certain type of torture as a young police officer, right? And it's a long legacy. It is institutional, it's deep, but it didn't come from nowhere, and it didn't come, and it's not to say that, it's only the colonial that is cruel, and it is, but there are also, feudal lords and practices that can be cruel. It's part of it. I think the question about culture and the sensitivity around is tied up with the notion that culture is one homogeneous. It is one thing, that it is not, cannot be challenged, and often we will find that there are challenges to what is established as and I think this is also a kind of a colonial construct, the idea of culture, and in the post-colonial nation states also, and elites, find this very convenient. But I think that to think about it, within any context, within any social group, there are people who are often critiquing, questioning, and fighting against forms of violence and oppression and exclusion. It is tied up in this sort of identity politics. It is tied up in ways of, people appropriate the language of anti-colonialism to perpetuate other types of harms. And we have to be very sensitive to that. But I think it is only through rich knowledge of these complexities and a deep engagement with and being informed by people whose realities are at stake in this, and working with them that you can actually find a way to navigate it. So I think from a distance, you're always going to be a bit ham-fisted. But I think if you'd have true relation, again, going back to what Kristen was pointing out, I think there are ways to know how to support and when not to do anything and when to do something in relation to these dynamics. And again, it has to be about deep contextual knowledge and relation.
Thank you for the question. So I've been thinking also about the debate, so the tension between universality and relativism, as it's often framed, for many, many years. Like 20 years ago, I wrote my undergraduate thesis about it. And so first of all, there's lots of literature about it, which actually will, say that, okay, we don't, just because we kind of throw the universalist, we can't, just because we're critical of, what we call universalism doesn't mean that we necessarily, go onto the side of, a cultural relativism in which everything is permitted in the name of culture. I don't think that's what anyone's saying. I think the critique is that what we call the universal was always cultural. I think that's the critique. The critique is that when we talk about culture, we're often talking about others. We're often talking about people from the global south or from Asia, Africa. We also have culture. I have culture, you have culture, we all have culture. Our culture also has informed and has played in a global geopolitical system with its legacies in colonialism, has informed what we come to think about as universal. But it is also, and so I think that's really important to acknowledge, and that's the critiques that people in critical childhood studies who have looked at, this idea of the universal child, that the image of the child in child rights discourse, for example, they've kind of critiqued that as actually it was Eurocentric. But what I think is also then important is thinking about how, as Ananda was referring to, is that there is always tensions within, and a culture is never a monolith. It's not homogeneous. There are always tensions, and I think that's what all of us have tried to speak to, thinking about gender, thinking about class, thinking about race. Because, even when we're trying to work with, religious leaders or customary judges, or, there's always contested spaces. People are always contesting patriarchy. People are contesting, there's ethnic hierarchies, that in many contexts, if you look at the history of caste in India or South Asia, these are also, often, not exploited, but reinforced for colonial purposes of governance and stuff. So these are messy histories that we need to acknowledge. But then we also have to acknowledge that this is why I think we've been focusing on power and looking and having a nuanced reading of culture, so that we don't actually go and say, okay, well, actually, harmful practices are, practices that might harm children, such as FGM or such as, I don't know, that these things aren't, we don't have to justify them. That's not what we're trying to do here, certainly. But.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Ananda, for this, and thank you for that question. I think the yardstick here is the word position. The position that you are assuming when you tackle that issue. That you have with that way of life. Are you coming in as somebody that is wagging a finger and say what you people are doing is right or wrong? Or are you saying that I am coming here and I'm trying to engage you because I come from such and such a place where I am from, this is frowned upon. May I please, humility, kind. I would like to know what informs this, because I am interested to know. Not I know that this is wrong. And again, the power of your voice as well. are you going to, when you have formed a partnership with local people and that you have an understanding of the practices that they do, because culture is not just culture. Culture is way of being. It's way of life. It's traditions. It's expressions. It is how people come to understand themselves. And it is nobody's place in this room to go wherever they work and be the one that gives themselves authority over what's right or wrong there. However, to understand your position in this, how you come into that space, and allow that to guide you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try. We cannot answer all to one question because we have other questions, and now we are going just to take 2 questions, and we can wrap because we won't have time. And I would even love to enter in this debate because I would have many things to say too. But let's, try to give space for others. So I'll pass the floor to the questions online, and we take these last 5 minutes before closing.
Yes, we have several questions from the participants online, but I think we can select 2, maybe from the ones that probably were not directly answered from the previous speeches. Maybe just to say overall that we have a lot of interaction from the participants online, nice. Remarks that are thanking the speakers, the panelists today, for the very interesting discussion. So on behalf of the participants online, I just want to say a big thank you for all the panelists and for the discussions today. And also maybe to say that the questions, we have taken note of the questions and of the remarks, and we will make our best to include them in the final report of this event and also answer some of them. So the 2 questions would be, first of all, from Deepali. Could the panel speak a bit more about how can we create spaces for critical reflection and action within the field to engage with these issues more concretely for informing our work? And how can we take forward the momentum and energy in this room today? That's one. And the other one is from Berlotte Antoine. It's more around the inclusion of family in this discussion and the role of the family. Is it possible to include the family, if around, to provide context in deciding the interventions that might be needed in the treatment of a child? Each child is different, and in some countries, each area of the country has different culture and customs. It makes it difficult to capture every aspect of the culture or customs that might be needed to better serve a child.
Thank you. I'm going to ask if the questions are not directed to someone specifically, so we would ask one answer per question. So,
moving forward. Yeah?
Yes, thank you.
I mean, to me, that's really important. And I during the break, I was already suggesting some ideas. I mean, I think this is, I appreciate my colleagues, and I think that this has been a very important discussion. I think it's not talked about enough. So how do you take this discussion and bring it to your own organization, your own field? Well, you know, there's going to be a tape of this, so I guess you can play it, you know, as a way of kind of inciting people to kind of have an internal local discussion, so it can be used as kind of a preliminary vehicle for that. I mean, I think sometimes we're just afraid to have these conversations. So I think sometimes you just have to set up a forum and say, hey, let's talk about it, and not be afraid. And not be afraid of what people say and actually be willing to listen to each other. So to me, that's a second idea. You know, that we're part of the International Reference Group, and the Reference Group has a meeting in November. They hold a lot of weight in guidelines and rules and all this kind of stuff, and so I think we can make a point of bringing this to that meeting, and I think discussing there maybe openly about what some of these issues are. And I would hope that this becomes a webinar, you know, and that it'll go online, it'll have questions, it'll have comments, and that we can be taking it forward.
Just to clarify that this initiative is not stopping here. This is something that is starting, and that we do not aim also to do this alone. So for the all online and in-person participants, that it is going to be a continuation, and that we do expect that there is an exchange and further discussion. We also gave the QR where all the different events and other things that we will be publishing there. So and for the report and suggestions such as further webinars. Or there was the question on the family that I don't know. And then we close and wrap up.
So I will say first something quick about the first question, then go to family. I think we need to see that INGOs who believe in localization, they start advocacy on the donors to really make it work. When we design programs, not about doing that in very quick, really having a space for all these discussions. I will not go more, but I will go to the next question. For me, I think the role in family is important, and it's always important to give the family the role to decide. So the question here, how we can balance between what the family want and the person, individual want. So it's not about only listen to the family, but also listen to the individual, the person, the young people. So because, yes, it's a collective identity where we come, it's about family, but it's about a new generation who want to change also. So we should to listen to them, how they want their community to be. So we need to do this balance between having the role of the family from one side and listening to the new generation who come with new attitudes, new way of living, and then help both them to decide and create a new way of living or the way they want to live. But without exposing intervention for both them. So again, it's not about going for individual or the family. It's about listening again to both who live in this community and the way they want to live. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shadi. I think we need to close it here. We're going to call our colleague, Sophie Barbey, who's going to give us a kind of wrapping up remark, closing remark. I want just to, before handing over to her, I just really want to thank deeply our speakers. It has been a long journey that we started. I mean, we initiated a few months back with several discussions to prepare this talk today. And I think continuously, I was trying to take notes. We are learning, and we are, there's a lot of ideas that are emerging from our discussion, our dialogue. So it really just convinced me that we are on the right track. Thank you very much. And for us, it's really just the beginning of the journey. Right. Thank you.
Thank you. So, dear esteemed panelists, dear guests, dear colleagues, I would like to start to thanking you sincerely from your delighting, insightful and rich contribution of today. Many of you, as Maria mentioned, have traveled a long way to be with us. And in the name of Terre des Hommes, I'm deeply grateful for your strong commitment in the time and efforts that you have put into preparing for this dialogue, resulting in making this conversation meaningful, inspiring, and impactful. So thank you very much. Your experiences and expertise, both from the academic perspective and the practitioner side, have shed light on the complexities and opportunities of MHPSS localization and power sharing and shifting. This blend of perspective has truly enriched our discussions, highlighting the value of collaboration across sectors. As I listened to you during the two sessions, I noted several points which I would like to share with you, which were for me quite key and several times discussed and repeated and came back from the discussion and also from the various questions. The first one is the word power. Yeah? It was quite central. It came back on every occasion, and there were many questions around. Many answers, but many questions. There is the giving power, the shifting power, taking power, sharing power, supporting empowerment. We were talking about that just before with also Maria. And also with the understanding that the notion around power, there is power with, there is power for, to, there is power within, and the famous power over. Yeah?
So coming from that, I continue, and it brings me to a second notion of the donor, the role of the donors, the role of the fundraising, because we need fundings, we need financing. So of course here we are still in this donor-driven approach with clear structure established, with bureaucracies, which is, you were mentioning that. So I took the notes from it. I'm not going to cite everybody all the time, but you will recognize yourself. Bureaucracies and the global tools, which are imposed on all of us, but also on the partners and local actors who have to find their ways to contribute into the debate. So then there is a need of the recognition of an imbalanced power between, it was mentioned several times, global north and global south. This binary approach is not a solution anymore. This black and white, Kristen, me too, when you mention your dress, I'm as well black and white today, so it's a black and white position which is not acceptable anymore. We need to move, we need to shift. So there is an importance, coming also from what you said, and I strongly believe in it, of recognition of the context, of the culture and education, of the history, which include also the inheritance, of and also of the history, of a region, of a country, of a state, of a community. We've just been also talking about families, and you brought back also to the level of the individual. So it's this not degradation, but this split down of from the global to the individual versus the universal framework. And we come back here to the one size fits all again. So there is a need to rethink and adjust the legacy, and that was mentioned on several occasions. One debate that I really liked was the question about what is local. The importance is clear here of having a thought and a reflection about that. And for instance, if we take migration, here, and you were mentioning that just before, we talk about people who are dislocated, I quote you, from their land. So there is a clear need to reconsider what is local, and then come here the reflection of what I know, what I think I know, and what I don't know. Yeah? And how do we, from here, humbly, decide and design together an intervention which will be and should be adapted with contextualized tools. And that was several times mentioned, the need of contextualization. And maybe the last 2 points before I continue my closure speech, because that was from the discussion, is the notion of the reticence to speak, or the blindness, you mentioned that, on power dynamic and inequalities, and the discomfort from where we sit and who we are. Here we talk about the diversity and the importance of recognizing that diversity is key when it comes to thinking together about localization. Yeah? There were a few words which I like: humility, attitude, diversity, thinking outside of the box. So thank you very much. Again, I really enjoyed, and it was for me a journey to be with you, and I think I will speed up my speech because it's quite long actually. I will go up là. And yeah, I need to shorten. I see the sandwich as well. So I think that, in other words, we have to recognize now that the transformation of power dynamics within the area, in particular of MHPSS, cannot be ignored. And that being interested in, recognizing and adjusting current practices together with all concerned and influent actors and players in MHPSS field will enable us to promote an approach that is equitable, fair, and culturally adapted to the reality, in this particular case, always in the respect of the best interest of the child, because that's central as well. So today, I think we can agree on the following: a real and sustainable transformation will require all the players involved, competent and influential, to be brought to the table in order to take sustainable decisions that will enable the decision-making process, powers of influence and control of resources to be shifted and or adjusted in favor of local players and communities. At first, the existing capacities of local actors need to be fully recognized. Then, local actors need to be respected, supported, and empowered to play a leadership in MHPSS operation in their own countries and communities, and to contribute actively to the regional and global levels of discussions and exchanges. Furthermore, relevant stakeholders, including donors, must collaborate to guarantee that partnerships reinforce local leadership and prevent the perpetuation of a partner and implementing partner dynamic at play. This will require us to think of a shift in approach from a one-size-fits-all control to tailor-made solution agreed together. This conference of today is important for TDH as it marks the launch of our initiative for localization and transformational power sharing with a long-term commitment to critical reflection and action. Today's reflection on the insights and recommendations shared will guide us, together with you, hopefully, in our work, and we confirm our strong commitment in rethinking our own practices to make space for local knowledge and creativity. Because it's one thing to organize something, it's another one to also implement it into our action. Looking ahead to 2025, our immediate next steps will be to identify influent stakeholders, which includes, of course, our esteemed panelists, to continue this discussion. We will continue identifying in the countries where TDH operates the actors in place and their existing dynamics at local and regional levels in order to put our initiative into practice and co-design in a way that is contextualized and sustainable. Based on the value of a collective thinking, we also commit today to ensuring that these discussions will influence the debate at regional and global levels. We believe that together we can take meaningful steps towards a future where MHPSS is not only locally relevant, but also driven by the very communities it seeks to serve. So I would like to say, and you were saying that, Nancy, so let's be serious on this matter. And let's move together to shake and shape the debate. I quite like that one as well. So once again, I thank you all. It was a great pleasure to be here today. I learned a lot, and I really appreciated the debate. It was also a very nice atmosphere. I thank you also, my colleagues, Maria, Lourdes, Kristen, Blerta, Leila, everybody, communication, Thierry, everybody, Alketa. And really, it was great. Thank you very much, and I think we can applaud ourselves. Thank you. And thanks also to the Club de la Presse. Merci beaucoup.